"You clean up nice for a nurse," my mother said, and the way she said it, chin lifted, eyes sliding past me to check if anyone at the reception had heard, told me everything I needed to know about what the next 8 hours were going to feel like. My sister was marrying the heir to one of the largest privately held development companies in Ontario. 300 guests. A lakeside venue in Muskoka that cost more per hour than I made in a month. And I was standing in the foyer in my good dress, the navy one I'd bought on sale at Reitmans 2 years ago, holding a card I'd spent 3 weeks lunch breaks saving up for, while my mother looked at me the way you look at a scratch on a new car. "Isn't she beautiful?" she said to my aunt standing beside her. She wasn't talking about me. My sister floated past in $40,000 of Italian lace, and I watched my mother's face transform, the tension dissolving, the jaw unclenching, every muscle softening into the version of her I almost never got to see anymore. That face used to be mine, a long time ago. My brother-in-law's name was Crawford. 38 years old, third-generation money, the kind of man whose family had a dock and a tennis court and called it a cottage. He was not a bad person. That was almost the hardest part. I stayed through the ceremony. Sat in the third row, where my mother had placed me, not the second, where my aunt and her husband sat, but the third, behind the family friends, because as she'd explained on the phone 2 weeks earlier, Crawford's people needed to see a certain image. And my husband, who drove a city bus for 41 years combined service between him and his father, who coached minor hockey on Tuesday nights, who once drove 4 hours through an ice storm to sit with a stranger's kid in a merge because the family couldn't get there, apparently complicated that image. So he wasn't there. And I sat in the third row and watched my sister say "I do" to a man who would never know that the person his new mother-in-law had quietly moved to the back of the room was the same person who had been paying her property tax bills for the last 6 years. If you've ever written a check that you knew was coming out of money you couldn't afford to lose, to a person who would never say thank you, you understand the particular exhaustion of that. It doesn't feel noble. It just feels like something that has to be done, and you do it, and then you go back to figuring out how to cover your own February. My husband's name was Owen. I should have led with that. When I introduce myself at work, I say, "I'm the charge nurse on 4 if you need anything." When I introduce myself in life, I should say, "I'm the woman who married Owen Beckett and somehow got smarter every year because of it." Owen was the kind of quiet that people mistake for simple. He wasn't simple. He was settled. There's a difference that takes most people a long time to understand. He hadn't come to the wedding because my mother had called him, separately, without telling me, 3 weeks before the date. She told him that Crawford's family had concerns about optics, that the venue was small and the seating was very carefully arranged, that she was sure he understood. Owen had thanked her politely, hung up the phone, and driven to the grocery store. He told me that night over soup, no anger in his voice, just the facts, laid out clean. I didn't sleep for 2 days after that. The reception was in a white tent overlooking the water. The tables had centerpieces that cost more than our car payment. I sat at a table near the side exit with 2 of my sister's work friends who didn't know anyone and a distant cousin who spent most of dinner on his phone. I drank 1 glass of wine. I ate the salmon. I smiled at the right moments. I did not cry. What I thought about, while the string trio played and the waitstaff poured champagne I wasn't going to finish, was a winter 6 years earlier. My mother had called me on a Thursday evening in February. I was just off a 12-hour shift, still in my scrubs, standing in the parking garage at Sunnybrook waiting for the defroster to clear my windshield. She'd gotten a notice from the city, property tax arrears. The penalty alone was $4,000. She didn't ask me if I could help. She just described the problem, which was the version of asking that required no visible humiliation on her part. I transferred the money on Friday morning from the account Owen and I were using to save for a new roof. The next call came 4 months later, then every year after that. Sometimes it was property tax. Once it was a plumbing repair that turned out to be twice what she said it was. Once it was a shortfall on her car insurance renewal. I never said no. I never asked Owen to help, though he always knew, because Owen paid attention to things like where money went and never made me feel bad about it. He would just look at the bank account and then look at me and say, "You doing okay?" And I would say yes, and he would nod and find something useful to do with his hands. My mother did not come to our wedding. She sent a card that said, "Wishing you both happiness," in her tidy cursive and a blender that we already had. She told people she wasn't well enough to travel. She'd gone to a garden show in Niagara-on-the-Lake that same weekend. My aunt told me accidentally 3 years later while trying to share a different piece of good news. I thanked her and changed the subject. The speeches at the reception were long and warm and full of inside jokes I didn't have the context for. The best man had known Crawford since Upper Canada College. My mother got up and spoke for 7 minutes about my sister's grace and beauty and the way she'd always known she was destined for something extraordinary. She cried at the end, real tears, the kind that take foundation with them when they fall. The room applauded. Several women at nearby tables pressed their hands to their hearts. I applauded too. Because what else do you do? Afterward, my sister found me near the water, where I'd stepped out to get some air and call Owen. She was flushed and happy, and her hair was starting to come loose in the back. In that way, that meant the night was going well. She hugged me. She smelled like the perfume I'd given her for Christmas, which she'd told me she loved, and then told our mother she found cloying, which my mother had reported back to me with visible satisfaction. I know all of this because my sister's best friend, a woman named Suzette, who had always been more honest than was comfortable, had a habit of telling me things my family said when they thought I wasn't listening. "You look so pretty," my sister said. "I'm glad you came. Not thank you for coming. I'm glad you came." Like my presence was a pleasant surprise. Like she'd wondered whether I'd show up for the wedding she hadn't invited Owen to. "I wouldn't have missed it," I said, and I meant it. That's the thing no one tells you about loving difficult people. The missing doesn't stop just because the being there hurts. I drove home on the 400 in the dark. The radio was off. I'd gotten used to silence on long drives because Owen had taught me that quiet doesn't have to be filled with noise to be comfortable, and being married to that lesson for 19 years had changed me in ways I still couldn't fully explain. I thought about the checks. 6 years of them. The total, which I'd calculated once on a slow night at work and then deliberately not thought about since, was somewhere north of $30,000. $30,000, which was roughly the cost of the catering at the wedding I just sat in the third row of. I wasn't angry, or I was, but it was the old kind of anger, the kind that's been composted into something more like grief. I was tired. I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the 12-hour shifts, or the short-staffed floors, or the years of holding people's hands while they went through the worst moments of their lives. I was tired in the specific way that comes from being the person who shows up, over and over, for people who would be shocked to learn they'd been counted on. Owen was awake when I got home. He had the kettle on, and the back porch light lit, which was his way of making the house feel like something warm and deliberate when I came in from a long day. He didn't ask how it went. He set a mug down in front of me and sat across the table. "The salmon was good," I said. He smiled. "That's something. They put me in the third row. I know." He'd known since the seating chart arrived. I'd read it twice, standing in the kitchen, and then folded it very small and put it in the recycling. We sat on the back porch until past midnight, listening to the neighborhood wind down. The Kowalski's dog 2 doors over, who barked at everything until 10 and then went silent. The distant thrum of the train that ran along the ravine, Owen's hand on the arm of my chair not holding mine, just present. I told him about the speech my mother had given. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I loved most about him, the quality of his listening, the way it made space for you to say the whole thing before any part of it got commented on. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "She's going to call," he said finally. Not as a threat, just as a man who had been paying attention for 19 years and understood the pattern. "I know. What are you going to do?" I looked out at the yard, the garden that Owen had built around what used to be a concrete slab, bed by bed, over 4 summers. The cedar hedge he'd planted when the neighbors on the east side got a floodlight, the tomato frames he'd made from scrap lumber, which were ugly and absolutely worked. "I don't know yet," I said. I was a trauma nurse. Had been for 14 years. Which meant I had spent the better part of my adult life watching people navigate the worst possible version of whatever they were already going through. You learn things in emergency medicine that they don't teach you in school. You learn that pain is not distributed fairly. You learn that the body will protect itself even when the person inside it refuses to. You learn that the moment right before someone asks for help is usually the longest moment of their life. What they don't prepare you for is applying any of that to yourself. The clinical distance that makes you competent in a recess bay does not follow you home. It stops at the door of your own life and lets itself back in only if you force it. I had been good at not forcing it. For a long time, I'd told myself that keeping the peace was a form of care, that absorbing the cost was a form of love, that staying in the third row was less painful than not being invited at all. These are the stories you tell yourself when you are the child who stayed and still got treated like the one who left. The call came 4 days later. My mother was selling the house. Not because she had to, she'd been talking about downsizing for years, and the Muskoka cottage that Crawford's family owned had apparently sparked a conversation about lifestyle realignment, which was the phrase she used, and which meant that she and my sister had been discussing the future over Chardonnay while I was driving home in the dark on the 400. She'd found a condo in Oakville. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a view of the lake if you leaned off the east balcony at the right angle. She wanted to move in by March. "There's a gap," she said, "between what I'll clear on the sale and the cost of the unit. I've done the numbers and it's about $35,000. I didn't say anything for a moment. "I know it's a lot," she said, "but with everything I need to think about it," I said. which was the first time in my life I had said that instead of yes. The silence on her end was so complete, I actually checked to see if the call had dropped. Of course, she said finally. Take your time. I hung up and sat with the phone in my hands for a long moment. Then I did something I hadn't done in 6 years. I pulled up the spreadsheet I'd made once in a bad moment and then hidden in a folder I never opened. The one that tracked every transfer, every amount, every date, every explanation she'd given that I'd accepted without asking for receipts. $31,420. I had not borrowed that from anywhere. I had made it, shift by shift, and moved it quietly into a hole in my mother's finances that had no visible bottom. And I had done it while Owen and I put off the roof another year and deferred the dental work and declined the trip to Nova Scotia that he had suggested every September for 4 years with the same quiet patience he applied to everything. I opened a new document. I started typing dates. There are certain moments in a life when something that was always true becomes impossible to keep pretending you don't know. That document was mine. Not because the numbers were surprising, I'd always known them, somewhere I didn't look at often, but because seeing them in a column made them solid, made them real in the way that things are only real when you can't make them vague anymore. I called my aunt that night, not my mother's sister, my father's. She was 72 and lived in a semi in Hamilton and had never once in my memory said a kind thing about my mother, which for most of my life I'd found uncomfortable and now found bracing in the best possible way. She answered on the second ring. I need to ask you something, I said. Good, she said. I've been waiting. She told me what she knew, which was more than I'd expected. She told me about the mortgage my mother had taken out 3 years ago against the house, the one she hadn't mentioned when she called about the plumbing. She told me about the loan from a private lender that had been quietly acquired against an account that listed my name as a secondary holder, an account I hadn't known existed, hadn't authorized, hadn't ever seen a statement from. She used your SIN number, my aunt said. The way she said it was careful and direct, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis she'd been sitting on for a while. There are moments when the floor shifts. When the thing you understood to be the situation reveals itself to be a very carefully arranged surface over something much larger. I had thought I was helping my mother with cash flow problems. I had not known I was also part of the collateral. My aunt had known for 2 years. She'd been waiting for me to call. Why didn't you tell me? I said. Because you weren't ready, she said. And because you needed to find it yourself. I spent 3 days doing nothing. Went to work, did my shifts, came home. Owen could tell something had shifted, but he did not push. Because he was Owen, and he understood that some things take time to surface in their own shape. On the third day, I came home from a night shift and found him at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of coffee and a look on his face that meant he was ready to sit there as long as it took. I told him everything. He listened. When I finished, he was still for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over mine. Do you want to know what I think? He said. Yes. I think you've been running a line of credit that she never paid interest on, he said. And I think you knew it, and you kept doing it because the alternative was admitting something that hurt more than the money did. That was the moment, right there. Not some grand confrontation, not a public revelation. Just Owen, in our kitchen, with the morning light coming through the window over the sink, saying the true thing without flinching. I went to see a lawyer the following week, not for dramatic reasons, not to sue anyone, not to launch anything. I went to understand what had actually been done, what the legal exposure was, what my options were. The lawyer was a woman about 10 years older than me, named Patricia, who had the particular efficiency of someone who had spent decades listening to people explain how things had gotten this complicated. She asked questions with the same quality Owen brought to listening, thorough, unemotional, present. When she finished reviewing what I'd brought, she set her pen down. The secondary account, she said, is the problem. Not because of what's in it, but because of how it was created. Using your identification without authorization is fraud. What your mother has done with it may also constitute identity misuse under federal consumer protection law. The private lender is going to want to know about this too, because if the account basis is fraudulent, the loan instrument may be as well. She paused. What do you want to happen here? She asked. I thought about the condo in Oakville. I thought about the $35,000 she'd called to ask for. I thought about the third row. I want her to know that I know, I said. I want it to stop. Beyond that, I looked at my hands. I don't want to hurt her more than she's already made necessary. Patricia nodded. That's a reasonable place to start. The conversation with my mother happened on a Tuesday, which felt wrong for something that large, but that's how it was. I drove to the house I'd been helping to pay for without knowing I was collateral on the debt that paid for it, and I sat in her kitchen and I put the printed spreadsheet on the table. She looked at it for a long time. Where did you get this? She said. I made it, I said. I've known the total for a while, but I didn't know about the account. The color in her face changed. I'd seen that specific shift before, impatience who'd just been told something they knew was coming and had spent a long time hoping wouldn't arrive. Your aunt, she said. Partly, I said. But the rest I found myself. The loan documents used my name as a co-applicant. I never signed anything. She opened her mouth, closed it. Mom, I said, I need you to understand something. I'm not here to destroy you. I'm here because this has to stop and because you need to understand what you've done. Not just to me, to Owen. To 19 years of us quietly covering a hole that you created and kept making bigger, I know what you were going to say. You were going to say you were going to pay it back, or that it wasn't as much as it looks, or that you had no choice. I kept my voice level. I've heard those sentences before, I know them by heart. She looked at the table. The condo, I said. I won't be contributing to that, and the account, I'm having my name removed, and I'm notifying the lender that I was not an authorized co-applicant. What happens after that is between you and them. You'll ruin me, she said. The word ruin landed in the kitchen and sat there. No, I said quietly. You created a situation that has consequences. I'm not the consequences. I'm just not going to keep absorbing them for you. I drove home in the rain on the 401, past the sprawl of Mississauga that never quite ends, past the interchange where the traffic always backs up on Tuesdays, and I felt something that I didn't have a name for immediately, but that arrived later, as I was pulling into our driveway, as a kind of clarity. Not happiness, not relief exactly, something more like the sensation of finally standing on the actual floor after a long time of not being sure where the floor was. Owen was in the driveway with a bag of birch pellets for the stove. He looked up when I pulled in. How'd it go? I said the thing. I said. He nodded, set the bag down, crossed the driveway and hugged me, right there in the rain, in the way he always did, arms solid, no commentary, just the full weight of him present. Good, he said. What I hadn't expected, what nobody tells you when you finally stop absorbing, is how much of the work comes after. My mother stopped calling for 3 weeks. Then she called twice in one day, both times leaving messages that were variations of the same theme, which was that she was losing the house, that the lender had contacted a collections firm, that my sister and Crawford were unable to help, that I was the only one who had ever understood her. The messages were long and tearful and expertly calibrated to the part of me that had spent 40 years trying to earn a softness from her that never quite arrived. I listened to them both, the way you listen to something that you understand and can no longer be moved by at the same time. My sister called next. She did not leave a message. She called 6 times over a Thursday morning and then sent a text that said, please, just call me back. I knew what the call would contain before I returned it, and I was right. Crawford's family had become aware of certain financial irregularities during the wedding settlement process. My brother-in-law's father had a notary who handled the family trusts, and in the course of some routine paperwork connected to the wedding gifts and the jointly held accounts, the private loan had surfaced. The lender, apparently, had been thorough. Crawford knew. He hadn't said what he was going to do with the information yet. My sister needed me to talk to him, to explain, to tell him that our mother had always been this way, that it wasn't about him, that the family as a whole wasn't. I can't do that, I said. What do you mean you can't? I mean, I'm not going to explain our mother's fraud to your husband as a favor to her, I said. Or to you. What happened is what happened. Crawford can make of it what he wants. That's his right. She's going to lose the house. I know. You're going to just let that happen? I thought about the dress I'd bought at Reitmans. The 3rd row. Owen standing in the parking lot on the phone with my mother while she told him politely that his presence complicated the image. Mom made choices, I said. For a long time, I made choices that covered them. I'm not covering them anymore. That's not the same as letting something happen. I'm just stopping something I was doing. My sister was quiet for a long time. She said you were the stable one, she said finally, and I wasn't sure if she meant it as a compliment or a diagnosis. Probably both. I was, I said. I'm still stable, I'm just not a vault anymore. She hung up. The house went through the process. I won't say it was easy to watch, because it wasn't. There is no version of watching your mother's home being assessed for forced sale that feels clean or right or uncomplicated. I had already grieved a version of her for a long time, the version I'd needed her to be, and she hadn't managed. But this was a different kind of grief, smaller in some ways, more specific. The grief of a door that has been closing for 20 years, finally making the sound of actually closing. My aunt came up from Hamilton in November. She and Owen had always gotten along in the way that people get along when they share a fundamental quality, which, in their case, was the ability to say accurate things without performance. They sat at our kitchen table and drank the coffee I made and talked about things that had nothing to do with my mother or my sister, and at some point I realized that was exactly what I needed. Not discussion, not processing, just the ordinary company of people who were glad to be there. Crawford and my sister separated the following spring. Not because of my mother, or not only. The notary's discovery had opened a conversation between them that revealed other things, the way that kind of discovery always does. I don't know the details and didn't ask. My sister called me twice during the process. I answered both times, listened, didn't offer to fix anything, and told her I was sorry she was going through it. Both of those things were true. My mother moved into a rental apartment in Brampton, 2 bedrooms, a parking spot included. She texted me the address when she moved in. I acknowledged it. I didn't visit. A few months later, on a Saturday in September, Owen finally got the roof replaced. We'd been waiting 11 years, patching it twice and hoping. And when the roofers came down at the end of the second day and told us it was done, Owen stood in the driveway and looked up at it the way he looked at things that had required patience, with a kind of steady satisfaction that had no performance in it. I stood next to him. "Nova Scotia," he said. "We've been putting off a trip to Nova Scotia for 4 years." He'd said it the same way for 4 years, and I'd always deflected. I looked at the new roof. I thought about the spreadsheet, the lawyer, the Tuesday conversation in my mother's kitchen, the rain on the 401. "Book it," I said. He looked at me, smiled, that small, one-sided thing that was his version of a celebration. Yeah. We went in October, drove the Cabot Trail in a rental car that smelled like someone else's air freshener and made a sound on hills that concerned us both and didn't care. Ate chowder in a diner in Cheticamp where the woman behind the counter called Owen Love and refilled his coffee without being asked. Stood on a headland above the Atlantic on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky was the particular blue that only happens in fall, and Owen put his arm around me and we stood there without saying anything for a long time. There are things you can only afford once you stop paying for someone else's choices. Not just money things, time things, peace things, the ordinary luxury of a Tuesday afternoon where no one needs anything from you that you haven't already freely given. I thought about what I'd given over the years, the checks, yes, but also the silence, the absorbed insults, the third row, the willingness to make myself small enough to fit whatever space she decided I should occupy. I'd done all of that out of something I called love, and maybe it was. Maybe love is sometimes an action you keep performing past the point of being returned, and the thing that makes it love rather than weakness is the intention behind it. I don't know. I'm a trauma nurse, not a philosopher. What I know is bodies, and what I've learned from bodies is that the ones who survive are not always the ones who fight the hardest. Sometimes they're the ones who stop spending energy on wounds that have already been made and use what's left on what can still heal. My mother texted on Christmas morning. It said Merry Christmas. I thought about it for a while. Then I wrote back Merry Christmas. 2 words back for 2 words given. That felt right. Not cold, not warm. Just honest. Owen made eggs. We ate at the kitchen table with the back door open a crack, because the winter morning was one of those rare ones that smells clean all the way through, and the dog from 2 doors over barked at something and then went quiet, and the train in the ravine did its thing, and I drank my coffee and looked at my husband's hands on the table, the same hands that had coached minor hockey and driven that city bus and built the garden bed by bed, and I thought, this is what wealth actually is. Not the absence of difficulty, the presence of something that difficulty can't reach. The people who look at your life and see what's missing will never see what they're looking at. They don't have the right instrument. You stop trying to explain the reading to someone who doesn't own a thermometer. You just keep going and you let the life you actually chose prove itself, one ordinary morning at a time.